welcome everyone. I know these are not easy times, but I think that the best thing we can do is, keep going and keep learning, and for me to keep teaching. And so we are starting our new series for the new year. And we're going to be, this year, we're going to be looking at biblical interpretation in Second Temple literature and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls are included in Second Temple literature, but I figured I would spell it out. So what do I mean? Let's start just by what do I mean when I say Second Temple literature? I mean Jewish texts written during the Second Temple period. In terms of what do I mean by the Second Temple period, I am going from Shivat Zion, return to Zion, so that's around 538 BCE, all the way to the destruction to 70 CE, maybe a little bit beyond if we decide to look at 4th Ezra and 2nd Baruch. Those are written about 100 CE, but those have less biblical interpretation, perhaps. They have some, but then some of the other, and a lot of the other works we're going to be talking about. So the books that are included in this very wide range of time include Dead Sea Scrolls, includes books that we call the Apocrypha, we call the Pseudepigrapha, the Jewish Pseudepigrapha. There are Christian Pseudepigrapha as well. We might even have a class towards the end of our series about Philo. Philo is a Jewish philosopher living in Alexandria around 40 CE, and he himself does a tremendous amount of biblical interpretation in an allegorical style, and we'll see if we have time for that, like at the end of the year, because of course, it's a very different style than everything else, pretty much, that we're going to be talking about, because he's coming from a Middle Platonist view of the world and trying to make biblical texts work with that Middle Platonist view. So it's a whole different world than all the other texts we're looking. All the other texts we're looking at really are going to be some maybe are somewhat diaspora based, but most of the stuff we're going to be looking at is kind of Judea based. Jews in Judea trying to interpret the biblical texts in ways that keep them relevant and meaningful. Okay, I'm gonna in just a bit we're going to kind of delve into what I mean by the different types of biblical interpretation. In this period, in the Second Temple period, what we have on the one hand is a Bible that everyone thinks is holy / important, and that has been relatively codified. And what I mean is you can't just go in and change it. Now, there are different biblical versions, right, at this point in time, right? Certainly, when we get into when we really have most of the text, not during the return to Zion, but later on, it's very clear that we have versions that are, let's say, more harmonistic, that do more work to try and make things work together than what ends up being the basis of our Masoretic text, which is possibly the one that keeps, in most cases, is the one that kind of has the most issues in a way that they don't try to solve. They're like, well, we can't change this. But there's a general idea that you can't mess with the biblical text. And what that means is when you have a text that is canonical, meaning this is important, we all learn it, we all read it, this is important for us, but we can't change it, you need to interpret and reinterpret it so that this truly important text stays relevant. In other words, this thing that happened to me today, where do I find it in this text? Or this text seems to say X is okay, but we know that X isn't okay. It can't possibly be saying that X is okay. So how can I explain it in a way that I keep my text, but also explain that X is not okay? Okay, we're going to see that with certain issues in terms of what is okay kind of for God to do. So one of the things, for example, that I wasn't planning to talk about tonight, but is a good example of this, is when the Israelites are leaving Egypt and God says, and they're essentially told, you should borrow stuff from the Egyptians. borrow all sorts of stuff made of, precious metals and things, and then you're going to leave and then you're going to keep it, right? That's the idea. And they're told to do this, and they do it. In Jubilees, when the story is retold, the angels explain that they told the Israelites to do it, and then they had to bind up Mastema, who was a Satan character, so that he doesn't accuse the Israelites about it before God. In other words, this wasn't super moral to do, but the angels made this calculation that this would pay them back for their slavery. They say that straight out. They're like, this is going to pay you back for the slavery, and so you could do it. But we also had to tie up Mastema, so Mastema wasn't going to accuse you of it and get you in trouble for it before God, right? And this was the angel's idea. So that's a way of kind of fixing something that biblically is not considered to be much of a moral problem, but is considered to be a moral problem for the people who are reading these texts in the Second Temple period. Okay, so that's an example of kind of the way that interpretation is needed, and also, of course, the same way we're used to interpretation today. There are gaps. There are problems in the text, actual textual problems where it's hard to understand. Characters that suddenly come up, like where are they from? Certain things that don't seem to make sense. And there are other things where they're leaving a gap that we feel like we need to explain, right? Classically, Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac, is a story like that, which is super, super simple. It's really, really stripped down. And so that becomes a platform for telling more and more stories about what's actually going on between Abraham and Yitzchak, right? Okay, because I wanted to say something that our next class, when I say that biblical interpretation begins right with the Second Temple period, certainly, because then we for sure have a codified Bible. Part of what I'm talking about, right, is the this idea that the books, biblical books themselves that are written, certainly the ones that are written in the Second Temple period, right, the books that are written Shivat Zion and forward, in the Return to Zion and later, okay, those books themselves are interpreting biblical books, okay? So I'm starting with now all the examples that I'm going to be bringing here, we are going to revisit them later in the class. So don't get worried if I'm doing them a little bit quickly. I'm doing it to kind of give you a taste of the sort of things we're going to do as we move through this class, okay? Okay, so your first two sources there, if you look in Vayikra Chaf Gimel Mem, okay, that's Leviticus 23:40, okay? So you have Ulikachtem lachem bayom harishon pre Eitz Hadar kapot tmarim. This is Sukkot, right? We just in recent memory. Ulikachtem lachem bayom harishon pre Eitz Hadar kapot tmarim v'anaf etz avot v'arvei nachal usmachtem lifnei Adonai Elohechem shivat yamim. Right? On the first day, you should take the product of Hadar trees, right? We understand it as citrus trees. In particular, we usually consider it to be the etrog, the citron, branches of palm trees, boughs of leafy trees, and willows of the brook, and you shall rejoice before your God for 7 days. Okay, and what is that rejoicing? If we go through to Pasuk Membet, verse 42, Basukot teshvu shivat yamim. You should dwell in Sukkot for 7 days. Kol ha'ezrach b'Yisrael yishvu Sukkot. All the citizens of Israel should dwell in Sukkot. So what do you do when we have in Pasuk Mem in verse 40? We're supposed to take these different branches and fruit. And what do we do with them? What are we supposed to do with them? Well, today we shake them, right? But according to the verse, what do you do with them? It's not immediately clear. It's not immediately clear what you do with these, okay? Now, in your next source, now let's go to a book that's written during the Return to Zion, right? Late in the Return to Zion, I have to say, because we're looking at Nehemiah, right? Nehemiah. Okay, so in your next, so this is Perek chapter 8. Okay, let's actually start from Pasuk Yudalid, verse 14. I'm just going to quickly read the English, okay, so we don't get too bogged down. They found written in the Torah that God had commanded Moshe that the Israelites must dwell in booths in Sukkot during the festival of the 7th month. Okay, and this is right before Sukkot. So this is actually, they actually heard the Torah essentially on Rosh Hashanah, and now they are going to celebrate Sukkot. So what do? They say, they announce, go out to the mountains and bring branches, leafy branches, or because it's alezai, right? Leaves of, but means leafy branches of olive trees, of this and understands as pine trees, but some kind of oily tree, and myrtles and palms and other like wide leafy trees, in order to make Sukkot, just as it is written. And that is what they do, right? So how are they understanding these verses in Vayikra, in Leviticus? They are understanding them to mean, what do you do with these different types of branches? You make the Sukkot that you're supposed to dwell in. That is a very clear interpretation of these other verses that we have in the Torah. So here is a very clear case where you have people in the early Second Temple period doing an interpretation of the verses, trying to figure out, okay, what do we need to do? Now, in our next, yes.
Which, I just didn't find, where did you read from in Vayikra? Which perek?
Oh, sorry, I'll say it again. It's Vayikra Chaf Gimel, Pasuk Mem.
Okay.
So it's 2340, Chaf Gimel, 23. Okay, so yeah. So, yeah, no problem. And in fact, in our next class is really going to focus on what we call inner biblical interpretation. So that's when you have a biblical verse that is interpreting another biblical verse. Okay, and we're going to be looking at that next week. There are many examples. Not only this sort of example where it's a clear idea, it's kind of a halachic interpretation. It's like a legal term, like what do we need to do? So we'll look at a couple of examples of those, but also things that are some of our early examples of what we're going to call rewritten Bible, which is retelling the biblical story in a way that solves the previous problems. So we're going to look at examples of that as well that are early on in the Second Temple period. Okay. Now, and so in this class, I'm going to touch on the different types of biblical interpretation that we're going to be looking at, so we have an idea kind of the scope of this, because a lot of times you're like, well, what do you mean biblical interpretation? What kind of biblical interpretation is there? And there is just a lot of it. In fact, Michael Siegel from Hebrew University says that one of the kind of creative forces behind the creation of Second Temple literature is, in fact, the biblical interpretation. In other words, that's the questions and the need to interpret and reinterpret the biblical sources is one of the things that's driving the creation of many of these texts. And it is certainly for certain texts, it's very clearly true. So let's take a look at one of the examples of a text that is like that, where the whole reason for the text is to retell the biblical story. So I'm going to drop another verse source in the chat, so you can go straight to the verse, and I will tell you where we're at. We are in Shmot Daled Chaf Daled. That's Exodus 4:24. Okay. So Exodus 4:24. It's the famous story of the bloody bridegroom, right? The bloody bridegroom story. Okay, one of the most puzzling stories that we have in the Torah, a place where we have plenty of puzzling stories. So here, this is a really a real head scratcher. Okay, so Moshe, background, Moshe is on his way. He's returning to Egypt at God's command to see Pharaoh. Okay, to see Pharaoh. And it says, Vayhi b'derech b'malon Vayifkashehu Adonai vivakesh hamito. And it was on the way in some kind of inn, right? And God met him, or the Lord met him, and tried to kill him. Vatikach Tzipora tzor vatichrot et orlat bina. So Tzipora took a flint and she cut off her son's foreskin. Vatagar liraglav, and she touched it to his feet, or she touched his feet. Vatomer ki chatan damim atali, and she said, "For you are a bridegroom of blood to me." Okay. Vayiref mimenu, and he let him go. Az amra chatan damim lamulo, and then she said, "A bridegroom of blood for circumcision." What the heck, right? The whole thing is nutty, right? Why did God want to kill Moshe? What is going on? Why circumcision? What's happening? Okay, very, very weird. All right. Now, it's not just weird for us, it was weird for generations. Okay. And just as a general idea, it does reflect the danger of passage from one space to another and the danger of travel, by the way. This idea that when you're passing from one state to another, and also when you're on the road at night, you are in a state where you are subject to strange forces, dangerous forces. But why should the Lord be one of those forces, right? It's troubling. So now, if you go back to the Google Doc that I have the link, okay? Let's take a look there, all right? For those who just joined, the link to the Google Doc is the first link in your chat, okay? Please go to that link and you will see. I hope everyone sees this in the very start, a rewritten Bible. I meant to do this in a different order. Just skip to the bottom of the first page. Jubilees chapter 48. Okay, does everyone have Jubilees chapter 48? Okay, great. All right, Jubilees chapter 48. Let me just take a step back. What is the book of Jubilees? I've mentioned the book of Jubilees before in all sorts of contexts. Written about 160 BCE. It's expressing itself. What Jubilees is supposed to be is it's supposed to be a retelling of the story of Breshit through the beginning of Shemot, that is Genesis through the beginning of Exodus. Okay, it's the real story, and it's the secret book that the angels gave to Moshe when he was up on Sinai. Okay, he went up on Sinai, and the angels are like, "Here's the real story. This is the book." And the people speaking are the angels, okay? Especially the angel of the presence, Malach HaPanim. But the speakers are the angels, or in general the angels, and they're retelling the story. They're telling it in jubilees of years, okay? So it's telling it in weeks of years, it's 7 years, and then jubilees of 50 years. And it's using a solar year. So this book, we have was read in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It was considered read by Qumran. It was considered very important by the Qumran community, but it was also read outside of that community, and that's why we have it in what we call the Pseudepigrapha, that is books that didn't make it into the Apocrypha, which is what the Alexandrian Jews kept, but did make it into some Jewish community, and through there got to a church. In this case, the Ethiopian church. The Ethiopian church kept the book of Jubilees and the book of Enoch. The Ethiopian church, I believe, was the first church actually outside of Israel. And so they kept some unusual books, and one of them is Jubilees. What we have of Jubilees, most of it is a translation of the Ethiopic, which is a translation of the Greek. However, it's very possible that the Ethiopic was at least influenced by the Hebrew. Ethiopic is a Semitic language with African influences. So they would have had, yes.
The Armenian church is the first church outside of Israel, as far as I know.
I don't think so.
It's from 301. From when is the Ethiopian?
Let me look it up. Um,
I believe that Armenia was the first country that made it the state church, but I believe the Ethiopian church was the first church. It was before it became the state religion, but Armenia was the first one. Before Constantine, he made it the state religion in Armenia.
Right. I meant as a country that took a.
Yeah.
No, I was just talking about any church. I
Okay.
didn't mean
Sorry.
official church.
Sorry.
I just meant any kind of like, I meant kind of like an official church, but not necessarily of the country. I'm sorry.
Armenia, the country was in the year 301. But I think there were churches that existed before then that were not official churches.
But at any rate, it's so this the pseudepigrapha in general, we generally look, and it's usually from the Ethiopia. There are some things actually in the Armenian, but in this case, we look towards to the Ethiopian church. They kept Jubilees in Enoch. So we have like fragments of Jubilees in Hebrew from Qumran, but very small ones. So mostly when we read Jubilees, we're reading an interpretation of the Ethiopic, which is interpreted from the Greek. So here we see, yes,
Jubilees and Enoch were actually canonized by the Ethiopians.
Yes, they are part of. That's how we have in general. When the reason we have books from this long ago is when they're canonized, not if they were just a fun read. Okay, they have to be kind of part of a collection. So otherwise, they don't make it to us. So, for example, the books of Philo, right, that I mentioned earlier, who was a Jewish philosopher, the Jews didn't keep those books, the Christians kept those books because Philo was dealing with what Christians later had to deal with, which was how do you reconcile Greek philosophy with Mosaic revelation, right? How do you reconcile those two things? That was something that Christians were very much involved with, whereas Jews were just like essentially not really using Greek philosophy until you get to the golden age of Islam and stuff like that. Like the Islamic, until you get to much later, Jews weren't dealing with Greek philosophy as a challenge, except for Philo, right? So and the Alexandrian Jews to that extent.
But the Rambam did it left, right, and center.
Yeah, much later though.
Yeah.
So the Rambam then was using, and Rambam actually used more Aristotelianism. Plato was dealing with Middle Platonism. In case I know that that's super important, but it is a different. It's a different. They have to deal with different philosophical challenges. But for Christians, this challenge was very much a present one for them. So they actually kept Philo and they read Philo, and Philo was directly dealing with what they had to deal with in terms of reconciling, not of course the New Testament, but the Hebrew Bible and the ideas of the Hebrew Bible with Greek thought. Okay, so back to Jubilees. So it was happening in this passage of Jubilees. Again, it's on the first page toward the bottom. Jubilees chapter 48. So again, it's the angel of the presence is talking. During the 6th year of the 3rd week of the 49th Jubilee, that would be year 2372, you went and lived there for 5 weeks and 1 year, 36 years. Then you returned to, you lived in Midian, right, for 36 years. Then you returned to Egypt in the 2nd week during the 2nd year in the 50th Jubilee, 2410. It's interesting, the chronology of the book of Jubilees makes it so the Jews both leave Egypt and come and enter the land of Israel during the 50th Jubilee. In other words, the Jubilee of Jubilees includes both the freedom of the slaves and the returning of the land to its original owners, quote unquote. So it's a cute thing that Jubilees manages to do. So he says, you know who spoke to you at Mount Sinai and what the prince of Mastema wanted to do to you while you were returning to Egypt on the way at the shady fir tree. Did he not wish with all his strength to kill you and to save the Egyptians from your power, because he saw that you were sent to carry out punishment and revenge on the Egyptians? I rescued you from his power. Okay, what is going on here? What is going on here is something very, very interesting. All right. What's going on here is it's saying, you remember that story when you were leaving Midian, you were going back to Egypt, and remember who wanted to kill you? It was Mastema. It was the Satan character. Satan, in Jubilees, Satan is Mastema. Okay. It was Mastema who wanted to kill you. And I, the angel, saved you so that you could go and do your thing. But we just read the verses, and who wanted to kill Moshe? God wanted to kill Moshe. It said God was going to kill Moshe, right? So here we have a story that on the one hand is saying, no, you got it wrong. God never why would God want to kill Moshe? That's ridiculous, right? No, Mastema wanted to kill Moshe so he couldn't go to Paro, right? That's what actually happened. The problem is that this story would make zero sense to any of us if we had read those other verses. If we just know the original biblical story, we wouldn't know what the heck was going on in this one, right? It's not giving us any information, right? We wouldn't know what it's referring to if we didn't already know the biblical verses. So on the one hand, it's assuming that we know those biblical verses. We know them, they bother us. And on the other hand, it's assuming that we're willing to say, oh, this is the real story. Yes, I see a lot of people are not, ask away, go ahead. Any questions? Anyone? Questions?
No, but it's quite clear from the verses that, like you're saying, that it's God. So, like, wouldn't people be bothered by the contradiction if they know the text?
Yes. So the answer is one assumes yes, but also one assumes that. So it's very similar. There's a classic, and we're going to talk about this in the next class. There's the exact same thing happened in a much earlier example where you have in Shmuel. Right, in the book of Samuel and Shmuel, it says, I think in Shmuel Bet, David counts the people. Why does he count the people? It says God tempted him into counting the people, and then there's a plague, right? When Divrei Hayamim, when Chronicles retells the story, who tempts David into counting the people? Satan, yeah. Right? So you say, but didn't we read? You're supposed to kind of forget that because now we're telling you it was the Satan, right? So it's trying to do the exact same thing. You've got a real theological problem from reverse. And it's big. Please, everyone mute yourself. It's a tremendous echo. Okay, thank you. I have to find myself again. Sorry. Right. So somehow you're supposed to let this override the previous verse, right? You're supposed to let this override it. How are you supposed to let it override? Did it work? That's not clear, right? Did it really work with people? Did this resonate with people? Did people go like, oh yeah, that's what it really meant? Right? I've given an example, excuse me. There's a song, I've spoken about it. Ani ohev otach Leah, I love you, Leah, right? And it retells the story of Yaakov and Leah, and Yaakov is saying, Leah, I love you. Yeah, it's the end. We're at the end of our lives together. Look at all your sons growing up around you. Leah, I love you as much as I love Rachel. Now, if you read the biblical story, no, he doesn't, right? But once you sing the song, you kind of feel. So there is this kind of idea that we can kind of allow ourselves to accept the fix. But did it work? Who knows? It's hard to know. But it's clearly that's what it's meant. It's meant to fix it. Okay, so moving back. So that's a classic example of rewritten Bible. Up above,
if you ignore Tzipporah and turn Tzipporah into an angel.
I think it's just erasing Tzipporah, to be honest. It's a nice idea that it's turning her into an angel. I don't think it's turning her into anything. I think it's wiping her out of the story.
But the story says that she did something, and now the angel is saying that he did it.
He saved her. What? Your wife saved you by doing a circumcision? I don't think so. I think she's being erased from the story. I think that part was also super weird. Honestly, I think the whole thing is weird. And so if it's cleaning it up, it's just cleaning it up. Like, I don't even think that this is necessarily a sexist thing. It's just like, let's clean this thing up, right? You know, the whole thing, she's suddenly doing a circumcision and throwing, yeah.
Who wrote the book of Jubilees and when? Miriam?
Oh, so we don't know the exact author. It's around from around 160 BCE. We date it, as we so frequently date these books, to when it starts kind of predicting the future, and say it seems to be written kind of in a reaction to kind of Maccabean times. But we'll go more into it when we later in the class.
Miriam, there are actually other examples in which the Book of Jubilees like takes away the credit from women. Like the Torah is much more like pro women than the Book of Jubilees.
Yeah, I mean, it's the sort of thing where yeah. And in this case, it could be either or. Like it could be that it's just like what we're gonna give her the credit, or it could also just be like the whole thing, like her doing the circumcision. It's the whole thing so messy that let's just cut her out. But yeah, I don't think Jubilees has a particular feminist bent. So I think it's perfectly fine cutting her out of the story. Okay, so our next example of rewritten Bible, you also see it on your page, but we'll just quickly look at the verse, which I'm now sharing with you. That is Breshit Yud Bet. It's just one verse, so you actually don't really need to. I just read the verse to you. But if you want to, it's Breshit Yud Bet Yud Daled, Genesis 12:14. 14 to 15 rather. Yud Daled to Tetvav. Vayhi kivo Avram Mitzrayma v'yiru Mitzrayim et haisha ki yafa hi ma'od. So when Avram came to Egypt, this is after Avram was already said to Sarai say that you're my sister, not my wife. So when he comes to Egypt, and in fact the Egyptians see the woman and they see how beautiful she is. Vayiru ota sarei paro, vayalu ota el paro, vatukacha isha beit paro. And the officers of Paro, or the members of his court, saw her, and they praised her to Paro, and the woman was taken to the house of Paro. Okay, so based on that, and now please turn to the document. You go to the document that I shared with you. It's the very first source, the Genesis Apocryphon. Okay, they praised her. So apparently, some wondered, what did they say? What praise did they give for Sarai, our foremother, right? So the Genesis Apocryphon is a retelling of, it looks like we don't have the whole thing. Genesis has a part of Genesis, part of Breshit as its name, and it's in Aramaic. I see that I'm already going a little bit over, so we'll do this quickly. And I will just read the English. How beautiful is the aspect of her face, and how pleasant and how supple is the hair of her head. How lovely are her eyes, how pleasant her nose, and all the radiance of her face. How shapely is her breast, how gorgeous all her fairness, her arms, how comely, her hands, how perfect, how lovely is every aspect of her hands. How exquisite are her, and I think the hands here, let me look at this. It could be her arms. No, actually, no, because then it would be Zora here, I think. How exquisite are her palms, how long and delicate all her fingers, her feet, how attractive, how perfect are her thighs. Neither virgins nor brides entering the bridal chamber exceed her charms. Over all women is her beauty supreme, her loveliness far above them all. Yet with all this comeliness, she possesses great wisdom, and all that she has is beautiful. As I have mentioned before, this has given every single married PhD student who is a male PhD student who has dealt with Second Temple literature a perfect quote for their dedication. Everyone has seen this quote at least once, because especially the end, and her wisdom is even more than her beauty, right? So it's a poem. If you read it, actually, it's kind of a poem in praise of Sarai's beauty, going into her various body parts, which kind of is surprising. But this is a case very much like much later Midrash, where it's just filling in a gap that you didn't really need to fill in. Like you could just say they praised her, but it's like, hey, what did they say? Well, here's this beautiful poem saying how wonderful she is and how beautiful and how wise, right?
It resembles Shir HaShirim a lot.
Yes, right. It's a lot like Shir HaShirim. It's a lot like the Song of Songs, and it's especially in terms of talking about her body parts, right? So it makes for a fun read, right, as well. And so that's another aspect of a rewritten Bible. It doesn't have to be solving a problem. It could just be retelling the story with more flavor, with more details. Moving right along. So those are a couple examples. Honestly, and I'll do this quickly because I know we don't have a lot of time. So the category of rewritten Bible is very, very wide, right? And so I could keep on giving you all sorts of different examples of rewritten Bible. I'm not going to. We're going to be talking about it later in the class. But I wanted to of course touch on some other examples that we're going to be delving into more deeply into later on, particularly the Pesher. If you turn to the second page of this document, you will see a quote from Pesher Habakkuk. The Pesher is something specific to Qumran. These other examples I was showing you are not specific to Qumran, obviously. Specific to Qumran is this type of interpretation called the Pesher. Okay, they call it a Pesher, which is why we call it Pesher. Okay, so they call it Pishroyu. Its interpretation is, and then they will. So in this case, as opposed to rewritten Bible, where you don't know the difference between the verse and the retelling, the whole thing is one. It's all baked in the mix with rewritten Bible, like it's all one story. Here, they very carefully quote the verse and then explain what it means. Now, why do we say that this is unique to Qumran? Aren't we used to that type of interpretation? Rashi works that way. Every sort of medieval interpreter works that way. You quote the verse and then you say the interpretation of those words. But in this case, in general, the interpretation is how it's talking about them, how it's talking about the people of the Qumran community, right? This is talking about what happened to us last year. Right, so that is unusual. It is not unusual though if you go to synagogue on Shabbat and the rabbi says this thing happened or this thing happened. Like we read this in the parsha, and that's what it means about the elections coming up. Right, so you hear that a lot of the time if you're talking about a sermon. But in terms of written interpretation, this is unusual certainly for us, but it's not unusual. Qumran, they have this kind of interpretation called the Pesher. So if you look at this Pesher, I'm just going to, for the interest of time, I will read it in. Let's read it in English. This is always a good thing to start with because it also talks about how they saw these books of prophecy. Habakkuk, of course, is a book in the Trei Asar, in the book of the 12. It's 12 minor prophets, called minor because they're short, not because they're not important. And and in this Pesher it says, then God told Habakkuk to write down what is going to happen to the generation to come. But when that period would be complete, he did not make known to him. When it says, and now we have a quote, Leman Yaruta Korebo, because God tells him to write. God tells Habakkuk to write this down, and he says, it's in order Leman Yaruta Korebo, so the person who reads it can read it easily. Okay, this refers to the teacher of righteousness, to whom God made known all the mysterious revelations of his servants, the prophets. In other words, what is God actually telling Habakkuk? Habakkuk, write this down so that in the future, the righteous teacher is going to, or the teacher of righteousness rather, is going to be able to say what it's really about, right? But you, Habakkuk, you're not going to know. Right now, note if you look at, you see that with ease is written like small and above the line. That's because the scribe squeezed it on top because it had been forgotten to be written. Like he was fixing it. Right. You see this a lot in Qumran text, and it indicates even more that there is a biblical text that they're trying to keep to. In other words, you can't just mess around with a biblical text. He forgot to write the words. He put the words. Of course, he needs the words anyway, but like he put the words in. Okay, but there are cases where they misquote, and Pesher Habakkuk actually has a pretty famous example of that as well. For a prophecy testifies to a specific period, it speaks of that time and does not deceive. This, as you can see, is also a quote. It's right in there quoting the prophet. They're saying a prophecy is of a specific period. It testifies to that time and does not deceive. This means that the last days will be long, much longer than the prophets had said, for God's revelations are truly mysterious. If it tarries, be patient, it will surely come true and not be delayed. This refers to those loyal ones, obedient to the law. In other words, this refers to us. This refers to those loyal ones, obedient to the law, who will not cease from loyal service, even when the last days seem long for them. For all the times fixed by God will come about in due course as he ordained that they should by his inscrutable insight. Okay, so I want to point to, if you're looking in the Hebrew, note that the interpretations always start with pishro. Its interpretation is, right? Pishro al anshe emet. Its interpretation is about the men of truth, right? So so the idea is that you bring a verse and you say, this is its interpretation. Its interpretation is about us. That's what it is. And Habakkuk himself did not necessarily know what his prophecy meant. Okay, so that's the Pesher, and we're going to be looking at that also more in depth later in this class. And finally, just very, very quickly, there are, of course, halachic interpretations, not just like the ones we saw in Nehemiah, but of course, continuous ones. And I will end with this example. If we look at here, this is a part of the Damascus document. It's talking about people who don't belong to the Qumran community. Why are they not accepting our laws? What is the problem? And essentially, they have fallen into the three traps of Belial. So they've fallen into the three traps of Belial, and one of those traps, and those three traps themselves are presented as an interpretation of a pasuk in Yeshayahu, in Isaiah, pachad v'pachad v'pach, right? Fear and pit and snare are alecha yoshev haaretz, are upon the dweller in the land, and they're saying these three things are the three traps of Belial. If we skip to line 20, okay, they're caught in fornication by taking two wives in their lifetimes. All right, we know that biblically, you can take as many wives essentially as you want. Kings are supposed to be somewhat limited, but it seems like you can take as many wives as you like from the Torah. And yet, they say, they are taking two wives in their lifetimes and thereby falling into fornication. Although the principle of creation is male and female, he created them. They're like, well, look at how God created man. He created it man and woman. And they're quoting a verse, right? If we look at that verse, then of course you can only have one wife. That's how they're interpreting it. And those who went into the ark, they went in 2 by 2. So they're actually looking at stories that we normally don't look to for halachic guidance. And they're looking to these stories to tell them this is what you are allowed and are not allowed to do. So these are some of the examples, and we're going to be looking at a lot of different types of legal interpretation that we have. This is really just a little taste of what we're going to be looking at through the class. In future classes, I hope that I will be able to share my screen so that we can look at the text together. My apologies for this. I hope that everyone was able to follow with the text that we used. And I just want to end with this, that what all of these interpretations have in common is the desire and need to keep the Torah relevant and central, Torah and Tanakh, relevant and central in people's lives, right? In other words, you have a bunch of people that these are their books, this is their guidance, and they are living in a different time and living sometimes with different ideas. And these books and the Torah and the Tanakh in general must stay relevant. And they are constantly looking back at these verses and troubled by issues, as well as needing it to be relevant to their lives. So we're going to be seeing this throughout the course. And I think that's one of the really fascinating things about biblical interpretation in this period, and really in all periods. So I hope you join me again next week. Next week, we're going to be looking at inner biblical interpretations. So we're going to be looking more at like books of Shivat Zion itself and how they interpret some of the earlier biblical books.